Hello and welcome back. This module is about Delta 8. We're going to take a deep dive into the science behind Delta 8, and we're going to talk about why we have concerns about its widespread usage. I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Ethan Russo. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome back. So welcome to this module on Delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol or Delta-8 THC. And we call this dealing with an emerging public health issue. Here are the introductions again, which you're welcome to read on your own. And I'm going to be doing a fair amount of reading today because in some instances the sources had such good quotations, I really could not do better. But the objective of this module is to acquaint the reader with the science, history, and controversy surrounding Delta-8 THC, which is a naturally occurring compound found in cannabis in trace amounts, but which has now infiltrated the market, particularly in the United States, through the synthetic production from cannabidiol. Virtually no commercial preparations containing Delta-8 THC are naturally derived, and quality control is severely lacking in the industry, leading to products that are almost invariably contaminated with byproduct compounds of unknown toxicological risk, as well as the presence of residual solvents. Now, historically, the story begins very long ago, in the 4th century, in what is now Israel, near the town of Beit Shemesh, House of the Sun. This carbonized fragment was found in a cave in the tomb of a young girl who apparently died in childbirth, unable to deliver a full-term fetus. Analysis of the fragment revealed what they called Delta-6 THC, now more typically called Delta-8 THC, a minor but highly stable cannabis component that's impervious to the heating process. It was surmised that this was utilized in hopes that the vapor could stimulate delivery, as has been attested to in later literature, but unsuccessfully in this instance. Then we skip way ahead. I'm afraid there's a mistake on this slide. This title refers to the prior slide. Anyway, Roger Adams in the 20th century was the foremost cannabinoid chemist. So he crystallized cannabidiol in 1940 from it synthesized two forms of what he called tetrahydrocannabinols. As was the common assay in those days, this produced static ataxia in dogs, made them wobbly on their feet. That's how they tested cannabis preparations prior to more advanced chemistry. He used 30 milligrams of what seems, in retrospect, to be Delta-8 THC, put them in olive oil capsules, and then tested 77 prisoners in New York. Half of them had prior experience of cannabis. So this is oral dosing, of course. The effects were noted somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes, were greatest between 3.5 and 5 hours, and were gone in 7. The effects are going to be familiar in comparison to Delta-9 THC. Elevated pulse and blood pressure and respiration, injection of the conjunctiva, red eyes, oral tremor, dry mouth, ataxia, anxiety, euphoria, loquaciousness, talking a lot, lowered inhibition, increased hunger and thirst, a feeling of being high with bursts of laughter and drowsiness. They asked about whether it had an aphrodisiacal effect, and no more than ethanol was the estimation. In using this repeatedly, some tolerance was noted with prolonged usage. Then, interestingly, he made the statement that the effects were not dissimilar in assays on high-ranking individuals and industrialists. So maybe some of them were not that different than the prisoners. Subsequently, in New York, there's what's come to be known as the LaGuardia Report. They were interested in the years following Prohibition in 1937 about what this drug was really about. So this is a then comprehensive study. They again looked at prisoners, 56 who had been opioid addicted. And these were given either 15 milligrams of this tetrahydrocannabinol, likely Delta 8, which was compared to Magendi's solution, which was an extract, opioid extract. And they were given this 3 times daily with or without placebo, which was a subcutaneous water injection. Um, then they evaluated the withdrawal signs and symptoms. It was felt that those that got the delta THC had less severe withdrawal and left the hospital in better condition than those who got no treatment or got the opioid maintenance therapy. Ones in the former group continued with their appetite and sometimes gained weight during the withdrawal period, which was distinctly unusual. Then we switch ahead to 1966. Earlier, the team of Professors Gaoni and Meshulam, who we see pictured here, had discovered the three-dimensional structures of cannabidiol in 1963 and delta-9 THC in 1964. A couple of years later, they showed that cannabidiol, when it was heated in benzene with toluene sulfonic acid, produced delta-8 THC. This method was patented and remains one blueprint for current efforts to turn surplus CBD into delta-8 THC. In 1966, the same compound was isolated from herbal cannabis, which was grown in Maryland, and they called delta-8 a second psychotomimetically active constituent from marijuana. And you see the slight difference in structure here. Delta-9 THC having a double bond on this part of the ring, delta-8 on this part. That is the only difference from a chemical standpoint. Subsequently, in 1973, Leo Hollister, who was the dean of clinical studies of cannabis in his generation, looked at delta-8 and compared it to delta-9. And for many decades, this was the only study of its type. So they took 6 men in their 20s and gave them delta-8 THC 20 and 40 milligrams orally as compared to delta-9, 20 milligrams orally in chocolate cookies. The effects were similar. Again, euphoria, tranquility, difficulty thinking and speaking, rapid thoughts, and decreased memory. As before, onset was in 30 to 90 minutes, peaking up to 3 hours and lasting about 5 hours. They said, quote, judged by global ratings, the 40 milligram dose of delta-8 THC produced the greatest effect with a mean score of 6.3 compared with 3.5 for the 20 milligram dose of delta-9 THC and 2.2 for the same dose of delta-8 THC. So using my calculation, this would indicate that delta-8 THC was seemingly about 63% of the potency of delta-9 THC. Subsequently, there were other studies done in Brazil on delta-8 and delta-9. They looked at 35 male medical students, and this time in inhaled studies of delta-8 and delta-9. They thought that delta-8 was half as active as delta-9 in inducing tachycardia or rapid heart rate. It was also 30% less effective in impairing time estimation. The average subjective psychoactivity score was 2.2 for 20 milligrams of delta-9, or about half as much, 1.3 for delta-8. But there really weren't any qualitative differences, although maybe people were less apprehensive on delta-8. They thought that delta-8 THC, because of its extremely low concentration in natural cannabis, was of minor impact to the effects of the herb. Subsequently, in a clinical study using synthesized delta-8, Professor Mechoulam and Abrahamoff in 1995 looked at high doses of pure delta 8 THC up to 0.64 milligrams per kilogram per dose to 8 children who had malignancies of the blood. So this would be different disorders, but particularly leukemia. They were between the ages of 3 and 13 and divided the treatments 4 times a day, and there were 114 exposures. They found that this was almost universally effective in allaying nausea and vomiting in these patients with minimal side effects. And I would point out that children under 10, from everything we've seen over the ages, are highly resistant to the intoxicating effects of THC in either form. Interestingly, the dose of delta 8 THC was 18 milligrams per meter squared as compared to the usual recommended dose in adults of 5 to 10, but was very well tolerated. And this is similar to descriptions from 19th century clinical use of cannabis. And this is just a rundown of the 8 patients. As you see, most of them had forms of leukemia, but there was also a Burkitt's lymphoma and a Wilms tumor. We also see that there were almost no side effects. Um, uh, Only one mention of something that was really indicative of intoxication of any kind. Coming back up to 2019, this was a nice demonstration with advanced analytical techniques such as liquid chromatography coupled with diode array detection that you can differentiate separate peaks of delta 9 and delta 8 THC. Now, not all labs are capable of this, but certainly it is there in the plant itself. This was in dried samples, but we can see similar things in fresh flower. In 2021, Babylonis et al. Looked at the status of delta 8 THC. So this was shortly after, in 2018, the Agriculture Improvement Act, what's been called the Farm Bill of 2018, had been passed. So this team blew the whistle on the market lacing of cannabis preparations with delta 8 THC that had been synthesized from CBD. And again, in concentrations far greater than that naturally present in the plant. They noted similar affinities and potencies of delta 8 and delta 9 at the CB1 and CB2 receptors with identical signs of intoxication. Quote, if high-dose delta 8 THC products are permitted to be sold, they should be regulated for content and purity and be sufficiently labeled to warn of the side effects and potential for toxicity or overdose. The diagram shows how cannabidiol, when it is dissolved in solvents with acid and heat, produces delta 8 THC. In 2022, these authors analyzed 27 products from 10 brands, none of which had accurate delta 8 THC labeling. Now, as compared to what they found in their studies, these varied by plus or minus 40%, which is obviously a very significant difference and could lead to massive problems. 11 had cutting agents in them that were not listed on the labels. Importantly, all of the preparations had reaction side products, what you could also term contaminants. These are included olivatol, which has been associated in e-cigarette use with what's called vaping use associated lung injury, EVALI. Now, this has caused significant morbidity and some deaths in recent years. They also found delta 4,8 iso-THC, 9-ethoxyhexahydrocannabinol, and delta 9 THC, also heavy metal contaminants, and a novel synthetic that had not previously been reported called isotetrahydrocannabifuran, about which its effects we know nothing. The U.S. Pharmacopeia weighed in 2021. Full disclosure, I'm part of the cannabis committee that is investigating such issues. Quote, while the AIA limits the Delta 9 THC content of hemp to be not more than 0.3% on dry weight basis, that's what's in the Farm Bill. The content of other cannabinoids or isomers, such as Delta 8 THC, are not restricted. So this is a loophole in the law. That loophole, quote, to bring intoxicating products to the market, unquote. Quote, synthetic Delta 8 THC may be associated with unknown impurities, different degradants, and synthetic cannabinoid analogs that are not naturally produced in cannabis hemp plant material and for which there may be little or no safety or toxicity data. They go on to say, the products labeled as Delta 8 THC should be tested for synthetic impurities and novel cannabinoid analogs and isomers. And just adding that these would include such commonly found things as Delta 10 THC, Delta 8 THCO acetate, which would be much more potent, hexahydrocannabinol, and tetrahydrocannabiphorol. The latter it's been recently demonstrated in natural cannabis, but in tiny amounts only in certain specific chemovars. It's important to note that its potency is estimated to be 33 times that of Delta 9 THC. So certainly a potential risk to consumers. Final quote, natural origin does not necessarily mean that these cannabinoids are safe at any level. So thus, making a distinction between the tiny amounts found naturally in the plant and the sometimes massive amounts found in these synthetic products. The ASTM also weighed in 2021. They estimated the synthetic cannabinoid market to be $10 billion by 2025, just next year. They also said, quote, the process to derive Delta 8 THC is a synthetic process utilizing harsh and toxic chemicals that are not safe for human consumption. Quote, they are in gummies, vaporizer cartridges, tinctures, and more. Its rise is largely attributed to the oversupply of CBD. To editorialize, CBD became a glut on the market. People needed something to do with it and turned to Delta 8 THC production. Quote, prices of both the biomass, hemp flower, and bulk CBD oil fell over 80% during 2019. This explains the drive towards this kind of commerce. Quote, a common method to convert CBD to Delta 8 THC was patented in 2001. The result is an impure oil that needs further cleanup. I would again editorialize to say that not many companies are engaging in such cleanup. Quote, can result in failed drug tests. Unknowing consumers can jeopardize their careers, custody battles, and other scenarios where drug tests may be required. Quote, nearly anyone with access to the internet can find videos online showing how to synthesize Delta 8 THC using acetic acid available in your kitchen as vinegar, alluding to a simple process that is ridden with unintended consequences. So by now, you're getting the idea that there are great safety issues attendant to such products. Chris Udalla is an analytical chemist, and he wrote an excellent article, well worth reading, about Delta 8 THC. And again, he has been very eloquent and will quote from his paper. Quote, I had a client who was in ICU for 10 days after using a counterfeit THC vape product, which turned out to be a mixture of Delta 8 THC with vitamin E acetate that caused her lungs to collapse. So this would be a case of EVALI that we've previously mentioned. Quote, the problem is not Delta 8 THC, but the unregulated distribution of synthetic contaminated products. He also said, quote, at least Walter White was a chemistry teacher. implying that uh, many people are less qualified to try to make this in the kitchen, which we cannot recommend to anyone. Quote, Delta 8 has become a money printing machine, unquote. Quote, nobody wants to send me a second vape cartridge for analysis when my first report came with a warning, not recommended for human consumption. This highlights a great problem in the industry, that the responsible labs who accurately report THC levels without inflation or issue warnings on the products they receive often go out of business in favor of labs that are less scrupulous and are willing to fudge data or not blow the whistle on bad practices. Quote, but when I show producers what is really in their sample, they don't stop making it. They don't stop distributing it. They just go to another lab who will not acknowledge the contaminants found. Quote, Delta 8 is not an agricultural product, unquote. Quote, the bureaucracy associated with an FDA regulated program would crush most current CBD and Delta 9 producers, inevitably forcing consumers to the black market. Hence the problems. And without better legalization and regulation, these problems will continue. Now, one I'd like to include it touches on another topic of interest that we'll be treating at greater length at a future time, and that's cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is associated with abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and hot bathing behavior in chronic cannabis users. So this study reported an alleged case of CHS related to Delta 8 use. So this was a 38-year-old woman who'd had a sleeve gastrectomy, presumably for morbid obesity treatment, who developed 5 days of nausea and vomiting, didn't have any CAT scan changes, and failed standard antiemetics. Based on history and a positive urine drug screen for cannabinoids and opioids, it was revealed on questioning that she'd been using Delta 8 THC gummies to help sleep for a month. She was diagnosed as having CHS and responded to haloperidol, major tranquilizer IV, and capsaicin on the skin. Well, this may or may not have been CHS, which usually requires better history than this, but certainly it indicates the likelihood we would expect that Delta 8 could cause the syndrome. This is a study that I have to criticize. I think that this was not subject to peer review to the extent that I would have liked. They did an online survey of 521 users of Delta 8 who are predominantly white males. They reported in their estimation that Delta 8 was less intense, produced better relaxation, euphoria in 68%, pain relief in a little over half, difficulty concentrating in 81%, short-term memory impairment in 80%, and paranoia in 83%, although that doesn't sound so benign. One user made the comment, quote, Delta 8 feels like Delta 9's nicer young sibling, unquote. Despite noting inconsistencies and that there was contamination in the products, they said, quote, Delta 8 THC may provide much of the experiential benefits of Delta 9 THC with lesser adverse effects. That statement is totally unsubstantiated, as we will see subsequently. So in that regard, in 2022, this study looked at US poison control data. Quote, people who use synthetic cannabinoids report a preference for natural cannabis products. This points out something important, which it has been evident that Delta 8 is more likely to be used in states that do not have legal access to other cannabis products. So to these centers, 7,600 synthetic cannabis exposures were submitted in the interval between 2016 and 19. 56% were reported by people in states with restrictive cannabis policies, 38.6% in medical states, and 5.5% in states with more permissive cannabis policies. Quote, adoption of permissive cannabis law can be associated with significant reductions in synthetic cannabinoid exposures, and that would include Delta 8. In this study, get a more accurate picture of the dark side of cannabidiol with subsequent use to make Delta 8 THC. They again indicate that when exposed to acid and heat, you get the ring closure of cannabidiol. And they point out something important, that there's no biosynthetic pathway that we know of in the plant to make it, but somehow it manages. Uh, and they thought perhaps that it was isomerized in the plant in some regard. They indicated that Delta 8 THC is a designer drug in this instance. It's true that many labs, even with HPLC, cannot separate, identify, and quantify byproducts associated with these acid-catalyzed ring closure cannabidiol products, and in other words, synthetically produced delta-8 THC. They point out again that these catalysts often or almost always end up in the final product. None of them have been subject to toxicological evaluation. They can contribute to this lung injury called EVALI. And they pointed out that by 2020, there were 2,558 non-fatal hospitalized patients and 60 patients with fatal cases of EVALI that have been reported to the Centers for Disease Control. Adverse events of Delta 8 included vomiting, hallucinations, trouble standing, respiratory distress, and loss of consciousness. Their impression was, quote, quality control is totally inadequate in the newly emerging Delta 8 THC industry. An excellent review was done a couple of years ago by Tagan and Klumpers. I'd highly recommend reading this one. In binding studies of delta 8 THC, the Ki values averaged 6.1 for human CB1 receptors, but was variable in lab animals. The two, delta 8 and delta 9, seemed about equipotent at CB2. They pointed out that the main metabolite of delta 8 THC, 11-hydroxy delta 8 THC, had not been assessed at that time. The paper had excellent reviews of the animal and human data. They also pointed out that at the time, no pharmacokinetic or half-life data was present in humans. They thought that oral absorption was similar to delta 9 THC, as well as other parameters. Another potential problem was highlighted in this study in 2023. In a preparation that was tested from a Blue Dream so-called vape that was purchased online, they found a synthetic contaminant, delta 8 THCO acetate, which would be highly potent, we suspect. It's a likely source of ketene after heating, and this shows the pathway involved. So that's a cumulative pulmonary toxin that's been associated with EVALI, that was previously most commonly noted when vitamin E acetate was used as a vehicle carrier in vape pens. The same could be true of other acetate esters. An analysis confirmed the presence of ketene in the study sample, suggesting that it was generated during heating while vaping. Another good study looked at the Food and Drug Administration Adverse Event Reporting System, which is called FAERS. It's important to note that both the Food and Drug Administration and the Drug Enforcement Administration consider all THC-like compounds, including delta 8 THC, to be Schedule 1 forbidden drugs, in spite of Congress's move in the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. In the FAERS system, which is the reporting system for non-approved drug products, there were 183 adverse events reports by 2021, especially shortness of breath, dyspnea, other respiratory disorders, and seizures. That was a twofold relative odds ratio increase from 2019 to 2021 and representing a significant safety signal. Of the cases, 33 were fatal, 109 were serious, 41 non-serious, and there were 49 associated hospitalizations. Importantly, the FAERS reports for delta 8 THC were 3 times as much as those for delta 9 THC, and more respiratory issues were noted for delta 8 than for any other cannabis or hemp product. Now, again, this is more likely due to poor quality control and contaminants than anything else. Very updated preliminary study by Ryan Vondre and colleagues at Johns Hopkins. This was reported at the 2023 International Cannabinoid Research Society. They did a series of studies to expand on what Hollister did decades ago. So this is based on 9 subjects out of Plan 20 who got oral or vaporized delta 8 THC or delta 9 THC, ranging from 0 to 40 milligrams. 20 milligrams of delta 9 THC showed stronger drug effects than all the delta 8 THC doses, although the 40 milligram delta 8 THC dose was comparable to 20 milligrams, confirming impressions from studies in the 70s that it is a little less intoxicating. Peak effects with delta 8 THC were stronger with vaporization than orally, and full pharmacokinetics on it and the metabolite 11-hydroxy delta 8 THC are pending and hopefully will be published soon. In conclusion, delta 8 THC may be found naturally in low concentrations in many cannabis preparations. However, selective breeding to increase its concentration will likely never be possible. The reason for that is we're not aware of any enzymatic pathway for its production in the plant. Scientifically, we can say that delta 8 THC is a low potency partial agonist at CB1 with an estimated psychoactivity 1/2 to 2/3 that of delta 9 THC. Pure delta 8 THC is proven safe and effective in clinical applications, especially as an antiemetic in childhood chemotherapy, but people should not be using it therapeutically because current commercial delta 8 THC preparations are all synthetically produced, are not pure, and harbor unknown but clear potential risk to consumers. So thank you for your attention, and I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Russo. That was excellent. I have a few questions for you. So how can people know if their Delta 8 products are clean, or can they? Is there
They really
anything?
shouldn't. I think the assumption has to be that we know they're all synthetically produced. There is no type, chemovar, or sample of cannabis to date that predominates in delta 8 THC as compared to delta 9. That means that it was synthetically produced from CBD. And based on what we know, we can generally assume that it's going to be contaminated with other, possibly more dangerous products, and quite likely to be mislabeled.
Mhm. Do you think that the FAERS numbers would be considerably higher if it was more widely known that that even exists?
Yeah, that's one factor. Additionally, I'm sure that most people don't wish to engage with any government agency, and so I suspect that the true numbers are much higher. People don't want anyone to know that they might have been using a cannabis product for obvious reasons.
especially in states where it's illegal.
Exactly.
So on slide 24, you talked about KI values. Can you explain to us what that is and why it matters?
Um, it's a dissociation constant. So it has to do with the binding. Um, and so it's a measure of potency. Um, so I think that's probably sufficient for general use.
All right. Um, in a past seminar, we did have the question, which I know the answer, but just in case any of our listeners are wondering the same, I want to ask it. The question was, if they could get a pure D8 product, would there ever be a reason to mix D8 with D9 to reduce psychoactivity of D9?
No, why not use a lower dose of Delta 9? So the only advantage of Delta 8 that we could really indicate is that it's more thermodynamically stable. And that's the reason that they were able to find this in the ancient carbonized sample from the 4th century. Um, Beyond that, no, I don't see any advantage.
Is there any opportunity for researching delta 8 acid, especially on like a pharmaceutical track?
Um, Gee, I'm not sure why. Chances are that it would be unstable as Delta 9
Mhm.
THCA is. Um, Before his death, Professor Mechoulam looked at esterification of cannabinoid acids as um, a way of making them more stable. That would be inadvisable from the standpoint of a product that was going to be vaporized or smoked because of, again, possible ketene formation and lung toxicity. So I don't encourage anybody to try that.
So you and I are in the United States, and we have a lot of labs that test cannabis purity. You mentioned that a lot of the labs that do testing for the cannabis industry may not be able to test for D8. For the ones that are testing for D8, do they have the capacity to also test for the impurities?
They may or may not. Again, a high level of expertise and the proper equipment's needed to make these distinctions. And you don't know if you don't look, and that's usually the problem. All these things cost money, and particularly if the manufacturer isn't interested, they're not going to ask for it. And they may not appreciate, as we've heard, if an unsolicited chemical appears in the results.
Yeah. Well, as you really pointed out so beautifully in this presentation, it seems like D8 popularity is really a function of people not having access to safe legal supply of Delta 9 THC.
Sure enough. Let me emphasize again, Delta 8 THC as the molecule is not the problem here. It's how it's made and utilized that is the problem.
Great. Well, I have no further questions. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up this module?
Well, I would just say that this presentation was on a rather specific topic. We will have more general topics in our introductory series, but this would be an example of a more intensive focus on a specific subject that will be available in our subsequent offerings.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank
Thank you.
you.